Greetings, everyone. Thanks for connecting here with us for the event, dialogue between Nancy Fraser and Andreas Malm on the politics of change. I'm Mina Islar. I'm an associate professor at the Center for Sustainable Studies and the facilitator for today. So it's a great honor for me to have these two critical scholars who are very inspirational for our time and the challenges that we face in our time. Well, what we do today is that Nancy and Andreas will discuss their recent works on the ideas about change, but also perhaps their different or similar theoretical entry points when it comes to nature-economy relations, and as well as some of the solutions they have to climate crisis and contradictions. I'm going to also give some few introductory remarks about Nancy Fraser and Andreas Malm for those who have not met them yet. Nancy Fraser is a professor of philosophy and politics at the New School for Social Research and currently a Hedda Andersson visiting professor at LUCSUS. She's trained as a philosopher, specialized in critical social theory. Her work on social justice, feminist movements, and social reproduction have been inspirational for many social scientists. And her recent works are Fortunes of Feminism, From State-Managed Capitalism to Neoliberal Crisis, Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory, co-authored by Rahel Yegi, Climates of Capital, and Contradictions of Capital and Care. Andreas Malm is an associate professor of human ecology at Lund University. He's trained as a historian and specialized in history of fossil economy and political economy of climate change. His recent books are Fossil Capital, The Rise of Steam Power and the Roots of Global Warming, The Progress of this Storm, Nature and Society in a Warming World, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, Learning to Fight in a World on Fire, and recently, White Skin, Black Fuel, on the Danger of Fossil Fascism, written with the Zetkin Collective. So as you know, our topic for today is quite ambitious. As you see in the description of the event, it's about what change must be done in the society, most importantly, how. It's not very simple to deal in 90 minutes, but I'm sure we'll do our best. So our plan is to start with Nancy Fraser to make an 5 minutes opening statement that invites Andreas also to this dialogue. My role here is limited. What I will do is to basically moderate the questions that comes from the audience. So feel free to write your comments and questions in this Q&A box. And I will interview Nancy and Andreas after your half an hour conversation. I will intervene and deliver some of these questions to you so that the dialogue can continue also together with the audience. So that's all from my side. Floor is yours, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Mina, and thanks to Andreas for agreeing to participate in this discussion. I know it's going to be extremely interesting, and I'm grateful to LUCSUS and the university and everyone who has been part of making these arrangements, enabling me to do this visiting professorship, albeit remotely, not the way I wanted, but it's been a very stimulating period, and I know that's going to continue today. So the question that has been posed about change in the current moment, I began to think a little bit about how to approach that sort of a question. And I want to suggest in a very schematic way, something like a 4-step procedure. I think that maybe the first thing that, at least as I try to deal with this question, is to start with some kind of an analysis of the current conjuncture. What is the situation that we are facing? Some kind of description, analytic description. Then I think we need, secondly, some sort of historical account of how we got to this pass. what's the route by which we arrived at, let's say, a major crisis or impasse? Third, some kind of a structural analysis of the deep sources of the trouble. And then fourth, a strategy for intervention that follows from these previous steps. So that's the sort of very general outline, and I'm only going to take a very few minutes in this brief opening statement to say a few words about each of those four things. So when I think about the current conjuncture, I say that we are in a very, very acute crisis and a very multidimensional crisis. It's a moment of what I would call a general crisis, not a sectoral crisis where just economy is in crisis or just social reproduction. I mean, just in quotes, those are very serious. But rather, this is a general crisis in which all sorts of dimensions of dysfunctionality, social irrationality, deep social injustice, in which they are all converging together and exacerbating one another. And so I think that we can say that the ecological crisis has become acute and intertwines with and exacerbates with a deep crisis of social reproduction, a deep political crisis, a deep crisis of work and of livelihood, and so on. So it's one big hot mess, in a word. And my thought is that none of these strands that make up this crisis complex can be adequately addressed in isolation from the others. They are so intertwined. Andreas, in his book on Corona and Climate, has argued, to my mind, very persuasively that it's really profit-driven tropical deforestation and global warming that, create the new species proximities that give us these viral pandemic outbreaks, such as the COVID one. We could see how that is exacerbated by the hollowing out of public power over the last 40 years of neoliberalization, which basically have deprived us of many of the capacities that we would have needed to deal effectively with this pandemic. We've basically outsourced the lion's share of the world's health-related resources, its labor forces, its material, its research capacities, its coordination. Those have been largely outsourced to profit-making firms, and so we're in a huge bind in just having the public capacity to deal with these things. Anyway, so it's a general crisis of the whole social order. It might or might not be something like a terminal crisis of capitalism. That's something I think we want to discuss. Okay, the historical account of how we got here. Well, the first time frame I already suggested is the last 40 years of neoliberalization, which have, as I say, hollowed out public power. They've deeply exacerbated greenhouse gas emissions and deforestation and all the other really world-shattering forms of ecological depredation that we're facing, because this has been a time of let's say, really unrestrained capital accumulation, absent even the rather paltry and not so effective restraints on capital in the previous era of social democratic or state organized capitalism. So neoliberalization has really brought us to a very acute moment, and it has really introduced a kind of a care crunch, a social reproduction crisis, by essentially transforming the structure of work into low-wage service economies that require many more hours of paid work per household, including from primary caregivers, at the same time that capital has insisted on austerity, on disinvestment from social provision by the public sector. So this is a moment in which you're depleting the resources for care at the public sector. You're pulling care hours out of household members into paid low-wage labor markets, including that of women. So even before COVID, even before the present moment, you already had an acute crisis of social reproduction. We owe that as well to neoliberalization. And obviously that impacts questions about livelihood and work. So that's the sort of immediate predecessor. Now, many people may believe that therefore neoliberalism is the deep source of the current impasse, but I don't think that's the case. That's not adequate. There is something in capitalism as such that's built in at a deeper level that is a set of contradictions or crisis potentials, crisis tendencies that are always present in every capitalist society, that are more or less dealt with, kept under wraps, at least for the wealthier, more privileged populations of the globe, with the externalities, so to speak, offloaded onto poorer and let's say, populations with less access to states that have the capacity to actually protect them, populations that are usually populations of color. So what I'm saying is that even the sort of patch-up strategies in normal times that deal with capitalism's deep-seated tendencies to crisis are pretty not universal, quite selective and problematic. Nevertheless, they have protected certain populations to a certain extent from having to live with acute crisis on and on and on. And that's really what has changed. I think even once privileged sectors are now face to face with an acute crisis. Deep structurally, I believe that there is a tendency to ecological crisis that is built into capitalism, which has something to do with the way economy and nature are set up in a kind of almost zero-sum game within capitalism. And I think the same is true with respect to social reproduction or care crisis. I think there's a deep-seated tendency in all forms of capitalism to that kind of crisis, and the same for political crisis. In every case, there's an incentive for capital to free ride on the necessary conditions of its own profitability, of its own capacity to expand and accumulate, which are inputs from nature for which it does not pay the full reproduction costs, a substructure of care on which it absolutely relies, but for which it seeks to evade paying reproduction costs there, and public political capacity on which capital's profitability absolutely depends, legal frameworks, repressive forces, public goods, all of these things that it relies on states and other public powers to provide, at the same time that is incentivized to evade and weaken and hollow out the very public power that it needs. Those are endemic, built into capitalism as such, in my view. Neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism, financialized capitalism is one phase of capitalist development, one kind of regime of capitalism that sharpens these contradictions to a fever pitch, and is where we are now. However, if it's true that neoliberalism is a phase rather than the deep structural cause of the problem, then we need a solution that requires more than a kinder, gentler capitalism, or the transition back to some sort of state-managed form, perhaps a global Keynesianism or a Green New Deal, or so on and so forth. I think we actually need an anti-capitalist solution, a non-capitalist solution. So that's my thought about the diagnosis, the history, the deep structure, and then the question that we want to discuss. And I think I'll stop because I'm going on too long, but maybe we'll follow this up in the discussion. Then what is the strategy now, a political strategy to build a very broad coalition of forces that could make the kind of really huge eco-societal transformation that we need to solve this problem? And in the current context, given the other forces mobilizing, including some very, very destructive ones, how can we think about the kind of political mobilization and political organizing that can constitute an emancipatory intervention with some chance of success, no guarantees, obviously. And my claim is that anti-capitalism is not only the sort of structurally required solution, but it could become the centerpiece of a new common sense of a variety of social struggles and social movements, in some cases political parties, all of which, have their own immediate problem and existential threat, because this crisis is lived differently depending on where people are situated in terms of what is most pressing for them, but all of which share a common root in these problems and contradictions of capitalism, its deep irrationalities, its deep built-in injustices. So my thought is that an anti-capitalist coalition might have the capacity to be large enough to make a change and to bring people into cooperative relations with one another as they are struggling against what is, in the end, one social system in which all of their deeply severe existential problems are rooted in the end. Okay, that's my first 2 cents.
Right. Thanks so much for that, Nancy, and thanks for doing pioneering work on the contemporary ecological crisis. And having read your most recent essay in New Left Review, I'm again struck, and now perhaps more than ever, by the way that you really managed to present a holistic analysis of the ecological crisis and how it's articulated to gender, and I mean the whole argument around the social reproduction crisis is truly brilliant, and race and colonial violence and class power, and bringing all of these factors into the picture. So the really serious problem with the conversation that Nancy and I are supposed to have here is that we have no real substantial disagreements. We observed this already before. So I hope the audience can help us with producing some dialectical movement in this conversation. I will try to invent 2 quibbles just to have something other than mutual praise and admiration to offer those who have tuned in here. And those 2 quibbles are on different levels. One of them is a little bit strategic about how to calibrate anti-capitalism in a politically productive way, and the other is historical. And I'm going to get to the strategic one just by way of a few reflections on how I see the current conjuncture, and focusing on the situation of the pandemic, which quite early on raised expectations that this could be the moment of a shift. This could be an opportunity for the long-awaited transition to begin away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy and other parts of a larger set of measures to deal with the climate crisis. Now, these dreams of a green recovery have been quite brutally quashed. There was a report coming out from the International Energy Agency in late April that laid out the prediction for 2021. And it says that we are likely to see the second steepest rise in CO2 emissions ever in history this year. The former record, the record having being the rebound after the financial crash in 2008. Last year, we saw a dip in global CO2 emissions by 7% because of the pandemic. But since the states around the world have poured money into fossil fuels, there will be a similar rebound this year, and we'll go back to business as usual, back to the growth curve, and this will be the very opposite of a green recovery. Likewise, and perhaps even more perversely in a sense, the deforestation of the tropical forests of the world accelerated massively in 2020 to reach the third highest level since comprehensive records began in 2002. And this, of course, is not only driving global heating, but also zoonotic spillover, because we know that deforestation is, as Nancy mentioned, the key driver of zoonotic spillover. Now, just today, the International Energy Agency released yet another report. I haven't had the time to read it. So this is from the report in New York Times, which says, sums up the report as saying, nations around the world would need to immediately stop approving new coal-fired power plants and new oil and gas fields and quickly phase out gasoline-powered vehicles if they want to avert the most catastrophic effects of climate change. And more specifically, this year, in 2021, nations would, this is according to the timeline laid out by the IEA, kind of path for averting the most catastrophic scenarios that bring us above 2 degrees and all that. This year, nations would stop approving new coal plants unless they are outfitted with carbon capture technology. We can forget about that. Nations would also stop approving the development of new oil and gas fields beyond those already committed. So the kind of minimum scenario here is stop approving any additional coal and oil and gas facilities. And I mean, IEA is not exactly a Marxist group. It's about as bourgeois an institution as it gets. And yes, this comes out as an incredibly radical demand because it has, I mean, it's directly opposed to current trajectories on the ground, which go in exactly the opposite direction towards more coal, more oil, and more gas. And I'd like here to give a special shout out to Brett Christophers, perhaps one of the most influential and sharpest social scientists working in Sweden these days. He's at Uppsala University, who just published an article in New Political Economy, where he goes through the plans of the three major, some of the major oil and gas companies. He looks at BP, Shell, and Total, all of which have now started talking about net zero commitments and things like that. And he shows that they are all planning for massive expansions, exploring and opening up new oil and gas fields around the world. So Total, for instance, which happens to be the single largest capitalist corporation in France, is going into the Arctic. It's opening new oil and gas fields outside of Mozambique and Uganda, and a lot of other places. And this, despite, well, but this is only an apparent paradox, despite the fact that prices of renewable energy have plunged, and solar power now produces the cheapest electricity in human history around the world. But there is no transition because these major producers of energy still gain far larger profits from oil and gas. And his central argument here is that the main factor in a transition, as long as we're dealing with private corporations, or for that matter, state-owned corporations that are also working to maximize profit, isn't price, it is profit. And as long as it's more profitable to produce oil and gas than solar and wind, this is what the big energy producers will do. And that's what they're doing. Now, yeah, I mean, obviously, this is not the whole picture, and we could go into some of the contradictions, including the recent pledges by Joe Biden and all the talk about net zero and that stuff. And I'm happy to do so. But my point here will be that we are in an existential battle here between humanity, particularly the part of it that lives in the global south, that's first in the line for all kinds of suffering in a warmer world. And the prospects of a kind of orderly human civilization on the one hand, and on the other, the fossil fuel industry, or as we refer to it, for instance, in White Skin, Black Fuel, primitive fossil capital. So the part of fossil capital that profits from oil and gas and coal. These two cannot both exist. One of them has to stop existing. It's as simple as that. And the very basic demand here that stems from all the recognition of the nature of the climate crisis, and the one that's now today even expressed by the International Energy Agency, namely no more new oil and gas and coal facilities. This is a basic demand that clashes directly with the very existence of this segment of fossil capital, which always profits from the production of oil and gas and coal, which means there has to be new facilities. There cannot be any further accumulation without additional structures for taking those fuels out of the ground. And this would make the kind of basic demand into what the political tradition that I come from would call a transitional demand. So a demand that correlates with very basic material interests, but because it challenges interests of dominant classes, has a kind of explosive force or a direction transcending the existing order. And here is when I want to come to the question of how we calibrate and how we phrase the sort of anti-capitalist edge that the climate movement and all its allies clearly need. And obviously, I'm in full agreement with Nancy about the diagnosis and the absolute importance for anti-capitalism. But my concern, and I'm partly inventing here because it's not really a major concern, but to invent a quibble. When we say that the problem is capitalism as a whole, the political risk might be that it's a little bit disabling or demobilizing, because it's a very, very tall order to abolish capitalism in total. I mean, the left as a historical force has tried to do this for 2 centuries, and we have failed quite miserably. And the version of this argument, I'm not saying that you are making it, but the version that exists on the left, the far left still, is the idea that we can't make any progress on the climate front unless we abolish capitalism. This is the kind of, I mean, the old SWP slogan, one solution, revolution, and all this. And my concern here is that another way to fine-tune the anti-capitalist edge is to stay at the level of basic demands that are transitional in their nature and follow a political dynamic that might, although we do not know it for certainty, because I mean, as you gesture at as in your article as well, capitalism is an incredibly protean and malleable and flexible system. So we don't know if this process necessarily means an abolition of capitalism, because at least if we focus on climate, I think we cannot say that we know for an absolute certainty that a capitalist mode of production is incompatible with 100% renewable energy and other types of climate-saving measures. But what we do know for a certainty is that one segment of the capitalist class absolutely has to go out of business, axiomatically, tautologically, and that is the section of the class that profits from oil and gas and coal. But it's if the necessary measures here were to be put in place, it's quite likely that you would start a political process that might very well move beyond the capitalist order. I mean, consider the case of Total. If that company were to be nationalized, as I think it should be, and if the French state were to take it over and say, you have to stop producing oil and gas from next year, and instead of pumping out more CO2 into the atmosphere, perhaps start drawing it down. Would that measure be compatible with the capitalist order in the country of France, or would it set in process a motion of transcendence? Obviously, my model here is the October Revolution in 1917, which didn't start by saying we have to abolish capitalism because it's the source of our ills. It started by saying we need peace, we need bread, we need land. These are the basic demands of the people. But fulfilling these demands means by definition that we have to topple the provisional government, and that's when you get the train going. So my quibble here is just how to phrase anti-capitalism in a very broad manner, as a kind of background analysis of the predicament we face, but matched with much more specific and narrow demands to get to find the leverage points where we can start to potentially intervene in the logical system. Second quibble is on history, and this is again an invented quibble. I'm thinking of an argument that you're making in the essay in New Left Review around the capitalist mode of production being inherently destructive of the environment, unlike other modes of production in history. And I'm thinking in particular on something you write on page 98 here. So you're right. What is unique is the structural character of the link between ecological crisis and capitalist society. Pre-capitalist eco-crisis occurred in spite of nature-friendly world views and largely thanks to ignorance, for example, through failure to anticipate the consequences of deforestation or overplanting. They could have been prevented, and sometimes were, by social learning that prompted shifts in social practice. Nothing in the inherent dynamics of these societies required the practices that spawned the damages. And then you make a similar argument around post-capitalist societies in actually existing socialism in the 20th century. Now, my concern here is that I'm not 100% sure that this is an accurate description of at least one important pre-capitalist mode of production, if you like, namely European feudalism. And it so happens that this is what I'm geeking out on myself right now in my own research. So I'm trying to read up on the environmental history of medieval Europe and feudal Europe. And my impression so far is that there was an inherent dynamic of environmental destruction in that mode of production as well. It was just on a lower level than capitalism. And we don't have to go into all the details here, but very, very briefly, between in the early Middle Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire and up to the emergence of proper feudalism in the 10th, 11th century, you had very extensive forests in much of Europe. They partly regrew, not the least in Britain, after the collapse of the Roman Empire. But the rise of lordly power totally presupposed massive deforestation and the transformation of very biodiverse forests into quite barren fields, if you like, of wheat cultivation. And the nature-friendly worldview that you refer to, I think actually was very, very hostile to nature in much of feudal ideology. Now, let's not discuss the historical details here, but my argument here will be not strategic, but scientific. I think that we, as Marxists, know too little yet about the dynamics of environmental destruction in non-capitalist modes of production, because virtually all eco-Marxist research so far has focused on capitalism, but there has been very little, if any, research conducted into, from an eco-Marxist perspective, into environmental destruction in feudalism, and I would like to add in Stalinist societies. So we simply don't know enough about the contrast cases to capitalism to be able to specify exactly what is unique with capitalism. Yeah, that's my second quibble, and I'll leave it there.
And Nancy, before you take off, there's two questions that's very relevant to the points that Andreas made. So I want to just bring them in as well. So one question is about whether a non-capitalist coalition would be difficult argument for especially people in the poorer nations, mostly communities of color, who aspire to participate in capitalist economies, to own property at least, and seek prosperity. And another one was also related to this last point, which is about whether or not capitalist accumulation requires the exploitation of nature necessarily, whether or not if capitalism can find actually a balance where its capacities to price nature can perhaps control natural degradation to some level.
Great, thanks, Andreas, for those extremely interesting remarks. And I think you did a very good job of inventing disagreements if they're invented, and they are by no means quibbles in any case. They are really serious and important questions. And the two additional questions that Mina just posed by some of the other participants are certainly related. So I think that we really don't disagree, Andreas, about sort of transitional socialist strategy, or what Andre Gortz calls non-reformist reforms. This idea that that actual organizing, actual mobilization, actual political practice is always necessarily around concrete demands that speak to people's lived and experienced needs and pressing problems. And so the real distinction is not between concrete demands and some abstract demands, but it's the question of which concrete demands have this system transcending potential. You know, it's sometimes, you can think of it in the way social democrats used to talk about the decommodification of labor. Those social democrats, especially in Sweden, actually, as far as I know, who didn't see social democracy as an endpoint, but as a transitional stage en route to a post-capitalist form of socialism. Their idea was that by decommodifying labor through generous social provision, you would change the balance of class power, give workers the ability to withhold their labor, and that change in the balance of class power would itself make possible more radical demands, and therefore this would have a radicalizing, expansive trajectory. So we want to distinguish between demands and ways of sort of formulating or thinking about social struggle that give people some improvement in the sense of coping, but close off routes, I mean, ROUT, paths to more expansive coalition, more expansive and more radical demands from those that promote it. And I think that you and I are completely on board about that. So the question, though, is whether a transitional strategy that focuses, I suppose, primarily or centrally on putting fossil fuel companies out of business, whether that would speak directly enough to those potential allies in a socialist eco transformation who are not primarily focused strictly on questions of energy and of nature, period, but are focused on livelihood, are focused on family, care work, democracy, et cetera, et cetera. You and I know, and I think most of the participants here in this session may already know that you can't do any of those things actually without doing something pretty dramatic to change the energy system and the interaction between economy and nature. But maybe that's not apparent to everyone. So there might need to be other transitional demands that have to do with how states support care work, or how they deal with a whole variety of threats to Black lives or Palestinian lives or whatever that might not be experienced immediately as ecologically driven. So I guess this is really a question about how the climate movement, the people who are already on board with some deep demands with respect to climate, how that movement is going to relate to other movements. And that's really the level at which I was thinking. So the question would be, let's assume, and I have no reason to doubt, let's assume you're right, that with respect to climate crisis, saying that we can't live with the oil companies, either they die or we die. I like that way of putting it, that much is clear. What would be the analog with respect to people who are focused on social reproduction crisis, or on the problem of rising authoritarianism, fascism, militarism, police brutality, et cetera, et cetera? Public health. I mean, obviously these are connected, but are there? That's the sort of question that you prompt me to sort of want to continue that line of discussion. Now, the second point. What was the second point? Give me another minute. About pre-capitalist societies. Well, first of all, I want to say that speaking for myself, you're absolutely right that I know too little about whether this is true of other eco-Marxists. I'm not sure, but I know that.
But I didn't say that you know too little.
No, but I'm saying
all of us know too little. Yeah.
But I'm saying this is emphatically true for me. I want to be very clear that I don't have a deep enough historical understanding of European feudalism to be sure I could make this case. But what I would want to ask, I mean, the specific point that you mentioned, which is extremely interesting, was that the emergence of a lordly power structure, lord vassal hierarchies, and so on and so forth, brought with it, or presupposed, I think was the verb used, massive deforestation. So I really want to ask why. Is it because we're talking about sort of lavish consumption spreads big manners? and how big are they really in the overall landscape of European forests, which are enormous? Are we talking about the military needs for open space, for warfare? I mean, I want to know why you would think that this really presupposed it. And because this is the level, how is it really systemic or not? My thought is that the accumulation dynamic that is basically given the quote, the room of its own. It's a pretty big room in this thing that's called the economy. That is a real systemic dynamic. And it's hard for me to imagine what the analog of that would be in pre-capitalist societies. I know that Robert Brenner at one point had the idea that there was a power accumulation dynamic in feudalism, and that could also be systemic in the way that the capital accumulation dynamic is. But I actually never fully understood that argument or why it was so persuasive. But this is what I'm looking for, a real systemic dynamic, not a set of causally connected developments that, you know, unfolded in a given way. Because if it's quote unquote only a set of causally connected developments, then you could imagine political interventions. And here, I guess we should talk now about really existing communism. Could imagine political interventions that could have changed the path of development without requiring a sort of deinstitutionalization of some central systemic dynamic. I can't imagine that happening in capitalism without precisely that kind of putting the accumulation dynamic out of business in the same way you want to put the fuel companies out of business. So I'm still unsure, again, fully confessing my real ignorance of what this counterpart to that would be in a pre or non-capitalist society. Let me stop there.
Andreas, you have some questions too. Do you want to take it now or after you respond to Nancy? So some of these questions is about different strategies. For instance, one is about, can nationalization of oil companies actually help to progress climate goals, given that there is a continuing extraction already by existing state oil companies in China and Brazil? Another one is kind of related also with whether or not decoupling of economic growth and emissions and resource use is possible. So in a way, more in the frame of ecological modernization. And the last question is also to you. What if the fossil fuel sector manages to transition and reduce emissions somewhat along the 2-degree target by moving into renewables and green hydrogen? Isn't it dangerous for the left to focus only on emissions? And shouldn't we also talk about growing energy demand? I mean, these are all, I guess, in the similar line of problems, right? So.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, on the question of nationalization of oil and gas companies. So the comrade who asked this question is obviously right that such a nationalization is no guarantee that these companies would cease to exist as fossil fuel producers. But in a situation where you have private companies that profit from fossil fuel production, you have to start by putting them under some kind of public control. And the easiest way of doing that is to just socialize them and take them over and shut them down. And in countries where oil and gas companies and coal companies are already state-owned, you don't need to have a change of the ownership structure. You just need to produce new directives to these companies. But in countries like the US, which happens to be the world's largest oil and gas producer now, this industry is entirely private. In Australia, which is the world's largest coal and gas exporter, the industry is entirely private. In Germany, which is the largest producer of the dirtiest form of coal, lignite, in the world, most of the industry, if not all of it, is private. And private property in fossil fuels is not compatible with long-term existence of humanity on this planet, because you cannot allow private agents to take up fossil fuels and sell them as they like for a profit. That just has to come to an end. So the starting point, the first step towards ending that, is to take over these companies. But clearly state ownership as such is entirely compatible with keeping a kind of state capitalism going on fossil fuels. I hope that clarifies my point. Now, very quickly on decoupling growth and emissions, and eco-modernization. I think that the degrowthers have conclusively demonstrated that you cannot have continuous growth forever without also having continuous growth in material throughput, and therefore you need to look at ending the process of self-sustaining growth. However, I also take the point from the critics of degrowth that in the moment of transition, which is a period that ideally lasts for a few decades when we rid the world of fossil fuels, some parts of the economy will have to grow to make up for what you destroy. So you shut down an entire sector of the economy, and if you don't want total chaos, you need to replace it. And that means that other sectors have to be massively amplified for a period. If that during the transition translates into aggregate growth or not is sort of beside the point in my view. But in the longer term, yes, decoupling as such in general is probably impossible. Is it dangerous to focus on emissions? No, I don't think so. I think that the focus really has to be on emissions if we're going to have any chance of dealing with the climate crisis. That doesn't say that the problem of emissions isn't exactly as articulated to all the words other problems, just as Nancy has laid out so eloquently. But a political program that says we have to change everything all the same, or everything at the same time, all of it at once, is very rarely a successful strategy for making political change. There has to be some selectivity and some focus in political campaigns if you want to have a chance of intervening in a systemic process that is extremely powerful. And the focus on emissions at this moment in history, I think, makes perfect sense. Now, to return to the questions raised in the comments that Nancy made. So, yes, I mean, shutting down the oil and gas and coal companies, how does that relate to allies struggling on other fronts, such as social reproduction? Well, I should say that I don't know if it does, and you're probably entirely right that, I mean, I'm not saying that shutting down those companies is the panacea, the one thing that solves everything. So it obviously needs to be complemented with other kinds of demands, and someone like you is infinitely better placed than I am to think about what those demands would be on the social reproduction front. On the front of race and the struggle against racism, let me just say that in the book that was released today by Verso that I wrote with the Zetkin Collective, White Skin, Black Few, we try to show in several cases that oil and gas and coal and the companies that produce them are very intimately tied to the far right and to racist actors in societies. This is the case in Norway, in Poland, in Germany, these being key fossil fuel producers in Europe. It's the case in US and in Brazil. And not to mention places like Australia or Canada or Russia for that matter. So there can certainly be a strong case made for an anti-racist politics that targets oil and gas and coal companies. And this was to some extent articulated in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the uprising last year. And I also think there are ties to be made to the social reproduction sphere. So, I mean, on the various front lines of oil and gas production, it's very easy to make the case that these oil and gas companies are also totally destroying social reproduction. I mean, in the Ecuadorian Amazon or in the Niger Delta or wherever they go. I mean, women and the people of color have been at the forefront trying to stop the destruction of their living environments for a long time. So that's certainly part of the picture, I think. But again, of course, a transition would be messy and turbulent and overdetermined, and not only include the demand to shut down the fossil fuel companies. I really want to stress that again. And I'm banging on about this all the time since I closed this book, but the most tremendous resource for thinking about how such a transition would play out that I know of is Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, The Ministry for the Future, which shows that, yes, closing down the fossil fuel companies is absolutely central to the process, and it would include some militant resistance, but it will go, if it happens, hand in hand with a multitude of social processes that in their various ways point beyond capitalism. Now, lastly, on feudalism. Well, I shouldn't pretend to be a medievalist here. I'm a total novice in this field, so it's not like I have tons of knowledge. But my understanding so far is that feudalism had its own dynamic of development, and lordly power could not be established as long as the European population subsisted on silvo-pastoral strategy. So, tending their pigs in forests and having agricultural practices that were not very intense. Because to establish a dominant class, which certainly existed in feudal society, a nobility, so the aristocrats that ruled by exercising violence, and the clergymen, the ones who prayed, not to mention the towns and the universities, all of this constituted a layer of people that lived without producing their food. So that class structure presupposed and called forth an intensification of agriculture, most notably on the domain, on the parts of the manors under direct control of the lords, where surplus was extracted from a peasantry compelled to cut down vast swathes of forest and turn them into fields for producing food, not only for themselves, but for the lords and their underlings. And this, I think, was an internal, innate dynamic of development that was, very closely linked to the mode of surplus extraction in feudalism. But you're absolutely right that it wasn't as destructive as the capitalist version of it. It wasn't as totalizing. It wasn't as especially explosive, spreading out all over the world. But it still was pretty destructive in the sense that most of the forests in Central Europe, Scandinavia being the one big exception, were gone after feudalism had established its grip on the European peasantry. Yes, I'll leave it there.
I don't know, Mina, can I say a couple of words now, or do you have some other agenda?
I think you can respond to Andreas.
Okay, I'll try to be very, very brief. Again, just on this last point, I'm really trying to think aloud along with you, rather than to be arguing against you, because I think this is a really interesting question. But I would say that what you just said seems to me to apply to all class societies in history, in which you have ruling classes that live off the labor of those they dominate. And I mean, we could speak about the Roman Empire. We could speak about I'm still not getting the sort of specificity here for the argument that this is systemic. So this is just something I want to think more about, and I hope you will maybe write something about it, or at least point me in a better direction. First of all, I also wanted to say congratulations. I'm very glad to hear that the new book is now out. I've been waiting for it with bated breath, so to speak. And I think that you're absolutely right to connect these fossil fuel companies today to the far right, to hugely destructive effects, above all, from on people of color globally and within countries. And I think that really and that you're right, that ties to the sphere of social reproduction could be made. But what I want to say is that you've challenged me to try to think of what the other transitional demands would be that could hook up. Because as you point out, for the Bolsheviks, the demand was not just land, it was peace, bread, and land. So what are our three big words? Okay, no more fossil fuel companies, but we are trying to put together, just as the Bolsheviks were, some kind of a multi-class or, we're trying to create a new counter-hegemonic and eventually hegemonic bloc, a historic bloc of forces. And I think that does require more of this articulation thinking, which I haven't done, but I really want to do. And I thank you for bringing that up. Okay, that's it.
So I have questions are buzzing here now. So first two questions, I can perhaps combine them a little bit. So one of them is about, and these questions are to both of you, how will the rapid end to fossil fuels affect energy prices and thereby jobs and livelihoods? And do you believe or imagine that renewables can make up for the shortfall fast enough? And if not, what are the strategic implications of the negative impact of this rapid decarbonization on social reproduction in the short and the medium term? And the question that we can link up to also is that what will be the role of state in this transition?
Nancy?
Should I start? I think, again, here we're dealing with this question of all these interconnections of apparently discrete social arenas and social issues. But I think that one thing that Andreas said earlier is very relevant, and that has to do with public control, nationalization, or public control of essentially of energy production as such. Basically, we've sort of outsourced that. Capitalist societies have outsourced that to a social stratum that has every reason to trash anything in its path that would slightly lower its profits. So I totally agree that the first step is to say these are public matters that must be put under public control. And I think that's true of so much else that might appear at first sight to be disconnected. Healthcare is so deeply privatized, so tied up with intellectual property, with manufacturing, with control of supply chains. We saw all of this. We are seeing how completely dysfunctional all of this is in a moment where we desperately need public health infrastructure and public control of health policy. I think this is true for the whole sphere of social reproduction. When we're talking about things like education, healthcare, housing, income support, and so on and so forth, we again, much of that too has been outsourced to people whose raison d'etre is to sort of, sort of nickel and dime everyone else to death for the sake of their balance sheet and for their stock prices. So I think there's a whole case to be made for for expanding public authority, public control over a whole range of issues, of which energy is a major one. Now, then we get to the problem of this question of the role of the state. Then we get to the problem that in the present, that means existing states. And we know that, probably 3/4 of the world's population actually doesn't have states that are in a position to control these things in a way that could actually make life livable for those who are nominally under their control. We can just look at Palestine, Israel at this moment and just look at the whole problem of the state and who has access to a state and who doesn't, and which states actually build their capacities off the backs of those without states, or those who are, with failed states, or states that are only nominal. So, then we have a huge problem about existing states, about and I think in the end, the need for global public powers that have at least some capacities on some issues that are genuinely global and cannot be handled at the level of discrete side-by-side territorial states. So, I think of climate and of public health in the moment of pandemic as obvious cases where we have to have global public powers, which doesn't mean that the services and things they deliver don't have to interface in a way that's genuinely participatory. The localities that are most immediately affected at any given point. Doesn't mean that global powers have to replace every other level of power, but we have to be democratizing and at least in some cases universalizing access to public power and public participation. So, okay, that's my thought about that level.
Yeah, let me just quickly respond to the question of jobs. As I understood it, the question was if we can make up for the loss of jobs when we shut down the fossil fuel industry in the renewable sector. Well, I think that the Green New Deal crowds have demonstrated quite convincingly that a transition can lead to a net addition of jobs for working class people. Because it's not only about renewable energy, it's about retrofitting housing, it's about public transportation, it's about, well, you could add, of course, healthcare jobs, and these jobs will also be quite different from precarious jobs amenable to globalization, to outsourcing to other countries. These will be jobs that don't fly to another country the next week because wages have become too high or something like that. So I don't think that we need to fear that a transition will have to cause serious job losses. Net job losses for working class people, but the strategic problem is that in certain fossil fuel producing sectors, it's going to be difficult to win the unions and the workers in those sectors, gaining their subsistence from digging coal, for instance, in the German lignite mines, to win them for a transition, because they don't see any, in Lausitz, for instance, in Eastern Germany, coal workers in their communities don't see, or Poland for that matter, an obvious alternative to their livelihoods, and the talk about renewable energy replacing their jobs appears to seem to them to be pretty abstract. So the way that those unions have actually worked so far is that they have opposed the transition fully, and have constituted a major obstacle to phasing out coal in Germany, for instance. Now, there is a recent case of a coal union in the US that apparently accepted shutting down the mines if they were guaranteed certain jobs. One of the beautiful things about direct air capture, something I'm working on with my colleague Wim Carton, who I see here in the list of attendees, is that you can make the argument that if you nationalize the oil and gas companies that are private and turn them into direct air capture organizations, you can keep all the workers employed. You just make them work on something else, not digging out oil and gas or drilling them, but putting the CO2 in mineralized form back deep into the ground. So I think there are multiple ways around that, but the problem is, can the workers in those sectors become anything else than obstacles for the transitions? Can they become agents of the transition? And I have to say that I'm not as optimistic here as some others on the left who think that workers, including in energy sectors, will lead the transition. I think it's a matter of getting them on board and making transitional demands compatible with working class interests. But I'm not sure that organized labor in the global north will be the spearhead of the transition, as some on the Green New Deal camp seem to believe.
But they might be part of the spearhead on the health front.
Yes.
Because the level of illness, right? So again, an argument for more connections.
That's great. What's our next question, which is, I think, a couple of questions is about this. And I know that both of you worked on, or at least engaged in these discussions in your recent work. So it is mostly about the way we conceptualize nature and society. So questions comes that is related with the language of capitalism, and exploitation of nature creates this pervasive dichotomy between society and nature, positioning themselves as separate. And how would we use this type of separation while also trying to mobilize for an action, for a radical change? So do you have basically possibility or some solutions how to overcome this type of dichotomy, which might be the problematization of how to mobilize all these different groups of people who has different types of ontologies? And this is like, of course, the last 15 minutes. I know I just poked this question in there now.
It's a huge question. And I just want to say, first of all, that the concept of nature is itself so contested, so multivarious, so plural. I mean, I don't know that we have one concept of nature. I think that we might have, I mean, the concept of nature, so to speak, if that is even a concept, in climate science is not the same as it is in, people who go to visit a national forest or something like that, right? So I think we're all sort of equipped with many different concepts of nature. I think just to get back to the place I always want to go back to, capitalism, I think that we have de facto, not necessarily in anybody's heads, but we have a particular understanding that is institutionalized in it, in the system, in the accumulation dynamic, which is that, and I sort of think that actually it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I would say that Jason Moore actually got something right about this, that there is this sense that there's at least parts of nature that are external to the formal accumulating economy, and that they get brought in by capital when it goes out prospecting for new profitable margins and so on, and they come in a sense as virgin, meaning without value, so to speak, and that based in this whole accumulation dynamic is this idea that there are those things in the universe that have value and those that can contribute to value production but are themselves somehow outside it. That's institutionalized. And what goes with that also is the assumption that this so-called nature is infinitely self-replenishing. This is, again, not necessarily in anyone's head exactly, but the practice wouldn't make sense if that weren't somewhere built into it, that you could just keep taking and dumping the waste, cutting off the mountaintops, digging out the coal, throwing out the mercury filings and everything else, and that it's not going to come back to bite you. So that's the understanding of nature that I think we really need to go after and focus on, and show why it's so irrational, so destructive, so problematic in all the ways we've mentioned. Then the question of then there's the question: do we need some new master understanding of nature that everybody in the brave new socialist world we want to make should share, right? Should we all become devotees of Pachamama or some other, right? I don't know what to call it, what Rawls would call a comprehensive doctrine, some way of, I'm not convinced that that's even necessary, but I like to focus on the enemy rather than on the assumption that we all have to share one worldview. As long as we rule out the one thing that is, drives out the possibility of the pluralism of other things, then I think we can worry later about whether we're all going to agree or not about that. And if we disagree, at least we'll be in a position where we can sort of process our disagreements in a fair and way that is not right immediately under the gun.
I can take other questions, Andreas, if you don't have any response to, because you wrote quite a bit on it.
Yeah, but I don't have much to add. I mean, I've made my views of Jason pretty clear, so I have no need to repeat them.
All right, and some of the questions that actually comes in relation to your recent work, Andreas, that is about the militant actions. And so there are two types of questions in this topic. One is our role as academics. So one of the comments are about whether, as role of academics, we can dismantle pipelines of harmful sciences, such as neoliberal economics. And what do we do as academics when we have other type of disciplines? And of course, the other line of the blowing the pipeline is mostly in relation to climate activism, whether or not climate movement can afford its core members to go to jail if they start sabotaging fossil fuel facilities.
Yeah, so first of all, if I understand the question right, I don't think that we should focus on attacking harmful sciences, to be honest, such as, as in we people from LUCSUS and Human Ecology Division going up to the economics department and smashing their windows or something like that. I don't think that would be a good idea for multiple reasons. I don't think that, Yeah, sure. They're reproducing bourgeois class power, but they're not the enemy really whose windows need to be smashed. I'm much more in favor of Extinction Rebellion's campaign right now, smashing the actual banks pouring trillions of dollars into fossil fuel extraction. That to me makes perfect sense. But there is something about academic freedom that needs to be protected. And I have a direct self-interest in keeping academic freedom a quite capacious phenomenon. So us starting to attack bourgeois economists is probably not the best idea. Now, on the question of repression, yeah, well, this is something that has come up quite a few times since I wrote my book, and I commented on it in a response to critics of that book. As I understand the question, what if core activists end up in jail? Well, first of all, there is no way that we're not ending up in jail. Every social movement that confronts very powerful interests will face the problem of repression. And you already see the climate movement being criminalized in parts of the world long before we have diversified into militant resistance. So the question is not, will there be repression or not? The question is, how do we deal with it? How do we minimize the blows to the movement? How do we evade repression as far as possible? And that to me means breaking with the idea that it's a goal to be arrested, which was very predominant when XR had their uprisings in Britain in 2019, where they actually, they were striving to get as many people as possible arrested. You need to break with that idea to begin with and try to avoid arrest for as long as possible. I mean, you could go much deeper into this question. And I mean, this is probably the first time in 10 days that I've been able to more or less concentrate for 1.5 hours on something else than what's happening in Palestine. But when the question comes to repression and how do you deal with ending up in jail and things like that, I mean, it's impossible for me not to lapse back into what we're seeing in Palestine, where you have people going to jail, not once, not twice, not, for a couple of weeks, but year after year, decade after decade, suffering every imaginable form of repression and still fighting and refusing to lie down and bow to injustice. And that to me is a model, that kind of endurance that the Palestinians are showing right now with the glorious general strike that they've had today in all of historical Palestine for the first time since 1936, should be an inspiration for the climate movement and any other movement that faces an incredibly powerful enemy and it has to wage a struggle that will have to go on for a long time. Now, I'm not certain that this speaks to everyone. I'm just laying out my own feelings around this, because for personal reasons, feelings have been running very high since this whole conflict started here in my household. But I think that the climate crisis, when it deepens, which it inevitably will do, the question is not can the movement afford to lose activists to jail? Because, well, that's the question. But the answer, I think, to it is there will have to be we have to count on an inflow of people into the climate movement and into the climate struggle, because anything less is to accept that humanity is on a suicidal path. If humanity is not, overdetermined by this suicidal drive, then the survival instinct means that more people will go into the climate struggle. And that's what happens when social movements grow and struggle with repression, that some people are arrested, others take the shoes of those who are arrested and continue the struggle. That's what you saw. I mean, that's what you saw last year in the US in the George Floyd uprising, and any number of other examples. So yeah, I could go on, but I should stop. Sorry for the rant.
Could I add one word on this? Not about, I totally agree about repression's inevitability, and but you shouldn't aim to get arrested and so on and so forth. But I'm just thinking about the conjuncture, the sort of state of play now among the political forces. And I would say that we have to factor in, give a more prominent place to the sorry, I didn't realize I was muted all that time. You didn't hear a word I said, right? Okay, what I wanted to say is that I would like to sort of factor in, as we think about the current conjuncture, the forces that we are going to be up against. I would like to make sure that we factor in the sort of popular strata mobilized on behalf of right-wing, power holders and forces. In other words, our social movements grow as the climate change crisis deepens and as these other crises deepen, but so do other movements who position themselves against us and having aims that they understand often, maybe not always, as even diametrically opposed to ours. And so our problem is not just the power holders, the corporations, the armed forces, and so on and so forth, but it is a large popular strata that we have to somehow figure out who is irredeemable and who we need to be prepared to fight in the streets if necessary, and who we can woo and how. I don't think we can assume that the worsening climate crisis simply grows us without growing them in some antithetical direction, and what we're going to do about that. That I don't have an answer per se, but I think that should be on the agenda here.
Yes, actually we come to the end of this event, but I still, before I close the session, I still want to give you some space if you have any final remarks to make. But as Andreas, you said at one point that it's transitions are messy, and probably movements will also be messy, that there will be different roles for different type of people to mobilize different types of actions. But if you have any final remarks, this is the time you can just make it.
No, just very briefly, I hope next time we can have this conversation in real life, because we're all so tired of the Zoom tyranny. And this is the kind of conversation that you need to continue, talk collectively together for a long time and continue with drinks or whatever. I mean, the fucking screen terror has to come to an end. That's my final word.
Great.
Well, that's a great final word. I couldn't agree more. In addition to all of our other agreements, let me sign on to that proposition. Okay. Thank you.
I agree. But another great online event has now come to an end. I would really like to thank you, Nancy and Andreas, for this provocative, very inspiring discussion for many of us who really want to, brainstorm about change. I would also like to thank to our technician, Daniel, who makes this setting possible and working in late hours, and all the participants for these great questions. The event is recorded, so it will be posted in 2 weeks in one of our websites. I will keep you on the loop. Until next time, and hopefully to physically see you one day, take care and stay safe.